Hey, this is Charlie, and this is my 95 Toyota Supra TT, technically a single turbo now. And what this video series is going to be about is configuring and tuning my car with AEM version 2. So I already have the computer and all of the sensors and stuff installed. I have another video on that talks about what the sensors do, why I put them where I put them, how to wire them in, where I mounted the ECU, what I did to my fuel pumps, etc. And I'll put that link in the description. But I want to talk a little bit about version 2 right now. And I chose version 2 mainly because I'm familiar with it. I've been using it for 9 or 10 years in a 3000 GT. I think it's really good software. It's probably the best bang for the buck software that you can get. It's a step up from like a piggyback system. It isn't as expensive as like a Haltech or a Pro EFI setup. And I know a lot of Supra people will say, well, let's get the most expensive thing for my Supra because it's a Supra. But really, version 2 does everything that I'm going to need. It can do ignition tables, it can do fuel tables, it can do boost control, it can do launch control, it can do no lift to shift. It can do flex fuel, even though I'm going to be running on pump. It has some nice safety controls like knock feedback and O2 feedback. Really everything that I need, and I like the interface of it. I think it's kind of intuitive. They give you descriptions. The layout is nice. And we'll be going over all of that. And the purpose of this video is to kind of show you what goes through my head when I'm tuning one of my vehicles. I only tune my own vehicles. I don't tune anyone else's vehicles. I don't want the liability of it, but I've been pretty successful with my own tunes, so I'm going to show you my process. So let's talk about the car. This is a 95, I said. This is the original motor. It's got 86,000 miles on it. I bought the car 2 years ago, and it has already been single turbo converted. It had an old school Turbonetics journal bearing turbo on it, had some 720cc injectors, and it had a 4-inch ETS front mount on it, and it was running on some piggyback systems. I think it was like a HKS old speed density kind of setup. And I tore all of that out, and I upgraded to a 6766 Precision dual ball bearing turbo. I polished the compressor housing myself. I did some bigger injectors, they're 1000cc, and I cleaned up some of the intercooler piping. I didn't like the way that pipe was routed, so I made my own. It's all stainless. And I did new couplers and some new T-bolt clamps. And the T-bolt clamps that I like to use are from siliconeintakes.com. I'm not sponsored by anyone. I like their product, so I'm going to show it off right here. They have this nice reinforcement here that I like. It keeps kind of everything in line when it starts to tighten. And I really like this little thing they add on to the end. So it provides a backing for a socket when it slips over, so it's not going to slide way down past the head, but it also keeps the end from splitting. And if you've ever seen some of the cheaper T-bolt clamps, kind of like the stuff CX Racing sells, you'll know the frustrations that those can cause you. So if I had built my motor and I'd done forged pistons and forged rods and bigger cams and port and polished head and all that stuff, I would not try to install and do my first startup on AEM and break the motor in. I would put the stock injectors back in, the stock ECU in, and I would break in the car with the stock stuff. I'd keep the turbo running on wastegate pressure, and I'd have a wideband gauge inside the car just for my own monitoring, and I would drive the car around. I'd do the oil changes, and I'd do a lot of engine braking, meaning I would get the car up to like 5,000 or 6,000 RPMs, and I'd let off the gas and kind of let the engine slow the car down. And that's really good for seating in the piston rings. You don't want to baby it, and you don't want to drive it like you stole it. You want it somewhere in between to properly break in a motor. But this had 86,000 miles on it, and all I did was change a few things out that were bolted on, so I don't have to worry about that. Now I know I've got that other video that goes over the sensors in great detail, but I'm just going to touch on them real quick. This right here is the map sensor. It's 3.5 bar, and that will tell me the pressure that's going into the intake. This is the IAT sensor. That'll tell me the temperature of the air going into the motor. The ECU can see those two numbers, and it can figure out how much air is coming into the motor, and then it can calculate how much fuel we need to give it. And that's what speed density is. Over here I've got the max solenoid. That's for controlling how much boost the motor is going to be running. And then right here is the wideband sensor for measuring the air-fuel ratio that's coming out the exhaust. And that's just the actual sensor that goes to the AEM controller. I don't have the full gauge kit from AEM because I don't want to run an AEM gauge. So the only way that I can see what my air-fuel ratio is if I have a computer hooked up to the AEM ECU. But I am running a BTI screen where the stock clock is, and that screen will communicate with the ECU, and it'll tell me whatever the ECU sees, so I will be able to see the air-fuel ratio on that screen. And then the other kind of thing is the cam sensors. So the Supra has two cam sensors. There's a front one. You can kind of see it straight down here. And then there's a rear one back here on the side of the head. And the stock ECU uses both of those cam sensors, but AEM only cares about the front one. So I've got the front one in. I'm running a suprastore.com block off plate for the rear one. You could just unplug the sensor and it wouldn't hurt anything, but those sensors are known to leak oil, and you can't get a replacement seal for them. You have to buy a brand new sensor that comes with a seal. So I bought the block off plate so I won't have to worry about it. And then I've got an extra spare seal off the rear sensor for the front one if it ever starts to leak. There's also two NOx sensors on this motor. AEM will be able to take advantage of both of those. So at this point, you may think we're ready to start hopping on the laptop, doing some tuning work, but there's still a few loose ends that we need to tidy up. And a lot of this stuff gets overlooked. And you'll see this at any tuner shop. They're usually behind, and the reason they're usually behind is people will bring their cars in, they bolted a bunch of stuff on, they think they're good to go, and they'll start tuning, and they'll realize there's boost leaks, or stuff is routed wrong, or you've got coil pack problems or spark plug problems. And we just want to cover all of that up front and get it out of the way. It's cheap stuff to replace and fix and test, and you can do it yourself. You can save yourself a lot of money, and you want it done for the tune. You don't want to bring it to a shop or spend a lot of time tuning on it only to find out that, hey, I just tuned all this and I had this massive vacuum leak or something else wasn't right, or my base fuel pressure wasn't right, so I have to go back and change stuff. So we're going to go over that right now. If you have a Supra, definitely check the coil packs. Mine were all cracked on the bottom. I've got a video that goes over how to check that. I'll put that in the description. Put fresh plugs in. I'm using some Iridium stage 8 coldness, gapped at 0.024 inches. That seems to be pretty common from what I read online. So get the plugs and coils out of the way. The next thing is going to be actually boost leak testing. You want to make sure all your clamps and stuff are tight. If you have any dry crack vacuum hose, replace it. If there's vacuum reduction you can do, I'd recommend doing it. If you've never boost leak tested before, there are some videos out there, but I'll go over it real quick. You can build your own tester. This is from some PVC pipe from like Lowe's, some 4-inch PVC with an air hose fitting on the end, and you can mount this to your turbo. I built another one as well for a 3000 GT. It's right here, and that's just a tire valve stem that's on it. And the idea is you're going to pressurize your intercooler system and check for leaks. So I plan on running around like 27 to 30 PSI probably. So I'm going to boost leak test to 35 PSI. You want to go a little bit beyond, and you're going to clamp that down really good on your turbo or on your intake pipe, and you're going to feed air into the system. If you've got a noisy compressor, it can be hard to check for leaks, so I'd recommend filling the tank and then unplugging the compressor or switching it off. That way it won't try to kick on when you're trying to listen. And you can listen for leaks. You can also spray some soapy water around all of the couplers, and if you see any kind of like bubbles coming out, you'll have a leak there. You'll want to check the throttle body seal. You'll want to check around the injector O-rings. They could leak there. It's also really important if you do hook it to an intake pipe. Some intake pipes could have a vacuum line coming off it going to like a valve cover. And intake pipes only see vacuum. They don't see boost. When your turbo creates boost, it's going through your intercooler. It's not charging your intake pipe. And if you're boost leak testing, sometimes you can't get the fitting right on the turbo like you can here. You have to put it on the intake pipe. And if you're doing that, be cautious of what else is hooked to that intake pipe, because you don't want to be pressurizing a hose that goes to your valve cover that goes down into your crankcase. You don't want to be pressurizing your oil pan or risk blowing out like a front main seal. So just be cautious of that. But it's very important to boost leak test, because you don't want to have boost leaks and have to revisit your tune later on. Plus it's robbing power, and plus you don't want to run into failures on the road when you first do a pull and try to hit 30 psi. You don't want an intercooler pipe to go flying off. It could be dangerous. It could leave you stranded. It could break something. If you've got an insulator pad under the hood and you had this pipe pop off at 30 psi, that would probably destroy this insulator pad. It would blow it all apart. I've seen that happen with 3000 GT guys. So boost leak testing, very important. The last thing that you'll want to do is set your fuel base pressure. And this is a AEM Aeromotive Regulator, and it's the best time to do this is before you ever put AEM in. So while your car runs and drives before, assuming you're not upgrading your fuel pump when you put AEM in, you'll set base pressure. And what you'll do is you'll disconnect this vacuum line and you'll plug it off. Some people like to put vice grips on it or cap it off. Start the car and see what this gauge reads. And you can adjust it up here. You can loosen this locking nut, and there's the Allen key end, and you'll thread that insert in for more pressure or out for less pressure. And you want this needle to read around 43 psi when the car is idling. And that's the base pressure for a lot of different vehicles. If you are running out of an injector duty cycle when you're tuning, you could go larger injectors. If you're kind of close to where you are to reach your goal, some people run a little bit more base pressure. But I like to keep it at 43 regardless. And if I do come down to the point where I'm running out of injector, I'd rather get a properly sized injector than raise the fuel pressure. But some people do that. It is possible. So once you get all of that stuff done, you've boost leak tested, you've got your base fuel pressure set, you know your motor's healthy, you know you've got fresh plugs, your coils are good, that's the time that you can start getting AEM set up on the computer and get ready for your first start. And that's what we'll be going into next. You can see that my car is still a little bit apart. I'm waiting on a new radiator shroud. A new one came yesterday, but it's damaged, and now I gotta wait for them to send another one. Once that comes, I can put it in, I can put my battery in, I can put my inlet and stuff back in. I'm also waiting on some heat sleeve for my oil feed. I redid it. I didn't like how the one that was in the car ran. It was close to the header, so I'm gonna run it a little bit differently, and I'm gonna put some heat sleeve on it. And then once that's in, I'll start showing you how to prep the ECU for first start. And one other thing that I wanna mention, I saw this laying on the car, is this can be helpful for when you are boost leak testing. It's just an old boost gauge I pulled out of a car with a vacuum line. So if you're trying to put 35 psi into your motor, you may not know when it has 35 psi unless you have someone sitting in the car looking at a boost gauge. So you can just leave this under the hood, zip tie it to something, and run this vacuum line. And then you can watch the gauge, and you don't have to keep running around when you're trying to soak everything with some soapy water and check for leaks. So today is the day I'm gonna actually show you stuff on the laptop. I just wanted to take a real quick video of the engine. I did boost leak test everything. I do have the factory fan shroud back in. You can see it's got some primer on it and looks a little rough. I have a new one coming that keeps arriving damaged, so that's another story. But the old one's back in for now. I did boost leak test. I did have a leak underneath this regulator, which is why I'm doing this video. And it's common for them to leak here, and what you can do is you can put a little Teflon tape around them, and then underneath the washer you can put a little O-ring that wants to hug the threads on this pretty tight. And that took care of the leak. I wouldn't recommend doing all that until you have your base fuel pressure set. I set mine a while ago when I was on the factory ECU, so I didn't have to worry about it. But if yours isn't set correctly yet, probably don't worry about the O-ring and stuff until it is. I also had a little bit of a leak here. I took this off. I put a little bit of RTV on both sides of the gasket and I put it back on. That seems to have taken care of it. Some of my couplers I needed to clamp down because around 30 psi they would start to hiss and form some soapy bubbles around the coupler, so that took care of that problem. These little nuts here on the throttle body, these start to leak around 30 psi, just a little bit, probably not enough to affect anything. I am going to take care of that, but it's going to be a while before I see 30 psi, so I'm going to leave those for now. Maybe this winter I'll take it off and delete this stuff and have it welded and re-chromed just to eliminate it, because this is part of the traction control system that I deleted a while ago. And then underneath the throttle body, you can see it. I've got a nipple right there, and I've got a vacuum cap over it. That also leaked a little bit, around 30 psi. So again, I'm not worrying about that right now, but I will take care of it. Probably what I'll do, because I don't like to use these vacuum caps if I can help it. The less there are, the less you have to worry about drying up and cracking and falling off and leaking. What I'll do is I'll grab that metal nipple and I'll wiggle it back and forth until it comes out of the throttle body. And then I'll tap the hole it came out of, and I'll put a little bolt or plug in there with some RTV on it, just so I won't ever have to worry about it again. But that was pretty much it. So it's ready to start doing work on the laptop, and that's where we'll go next.